Okay, so now we're officially starting. I want to welcome you to the 5th Musar webinar for this year. The topic is equanimity, which translates to Menuchat Hanefesh. And I'm going to share with you. Here we go. Are you able to see this now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Great. Okay, so let me just see if I can do this. Okay, so I'm going to start with the agenda. I'm going to start out this webinar the way I start most of them, which is reminding you to share interesting things your participants are doing on our Inspirational Chai Mitzvah group on Facebook. And I'll include the link in our follow-up email. And let's go to the themes. I just have to move some things out of my way here so that I can actually see what I'm doing. Okay, so there. Today we're going to focus on equanimity, Menuchat Hanefesh. So let's start with what equanimity means. It comes from the Latin counterpart equanimitas. Aquas means even, and animus means soul or mind. Judaism is not the only religion that value one's ability to remain composed, which is what we're talking about in times of stress. Hold on a second, I'm hearing from Janice. Tells me the connection is unstable. This is not good. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm going to just see what's going on here. It should be stable. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Back to what we're doing. So I think it should be stable. I'm going to try. Anyway, so as we were saying, equanimitas means even and soul or mind. So we're talking about, as you can see, there's a surfer here, kind of trying to keep even keeled through whatever life throws at you. Judaism is not the only religion that values this ability to remain composed in times of stress. It's part of the Hindu yoga tradition. It's a byproduct of the Buddhist meditation. It's a central concept of the Stoic ethics of the ancient Greeks, which for some reason I really like. And we're going to incorporate some yoga and meditation into the practices that we talk about at the end of this session. But first, let's talk about Menucha, which you know means rest. It's one of the 3 values of Shabbat, along with Oneg, which means rejoicing, and Kedusha, which means holiness. Shabbat is one of the primary Jewish spiritual practices that can actually help us to get to a place of Menuchat Hanefesh, an equanimity of mind and soul. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. As we go forward and look at the text for this session, I want to mention that 3 of the texts are from Musar masters. And we'll talk about them and a little bit of their history, like who they are and when they lived, as we look at their texts. Many of the Musar masters taught how important equanimity was to the cultivation of a spiritual life. As you know, this midah is called Menuchat Hanefesh in Hebrew, which literally means rest of the soul, because nefesh means soul. So that's important. And as we go through this also, and as you share this with your groups, think about you, or if anyone you know is suffering from a lack of equanimity. Some ways you can tell that you or someone is suffering from this is they might have an inclination towards indecision or making rash decisions, clutter, being overly busy, searching for ego gratification, ingratitude, and worry. Anyway, let's look at the themes. Equanimity is essential to the cultivation of a spiritual life, and it's translated as Menuchat Hanefesh in Hebrew, which literally means rest of the soul. So let's go on. A nice opening activity is this stress test. So begin by focusing your people on the times in their lives when equanimity is elusive. Give each one an index card and a pen and ask them to write down a stressful situation they've recently experienced or something in their lives that was so stressful that they're still thinking about it. Then you can either discuss the questions you see on the screen here as a group, or you can just think about them on their own, depending on how sharing your group kind of is. So one is, how did you deal with the experience? And the other is, do you think you got through it with equanimity, and why or why not? Because that will also encourage us to think about what equanimity actually is in an actual situation. And if anybody has a question or a comment, please just jump in. I can hear everybody, I think. And if not, we have chat. So any comments or questions? Okay, great. Let's look at the first text. This is from Menachem Mendel. I'll give you a little background about him. He was a contemporary of the U.S. founding fathers. He lived at about the time of the Revolution, the American Revolution. He was born in the Ukraine, where he had a traditional Jewish education, but it was supplemented by studies in science and mathematics and medieval philosophy. And in the early 1780s, he lived in Berlin, where he met Moses Mendelssohn and other Haskalah leaders, which, as you might know, promoted rationalism, liberalism, and freedom of thought. So he campaigned in favor of adding general education to the standard curriculum in Jewish schools, which was not something that happened at that time. And he was a fierce opponent of Hasidic movement and the Kabbalah, which he viewed as nonsense. So Leffin died in Tarnopol in 1826. This text is from his work called Cheshbon HaNefesh, which means moral accounting. Drawing from classical sources, it's like a step-by-step program for self-improvement and character refinement. The book gives hope and help to all who wish to perfect themselves. It's interesting. It was published in 1809 and was really influenced by the ethical program described in the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. So with all that in mind, this is a very short text. Let's just look at it. It says, "Rise above events that are inconsequential, both bad and good, for they are not worth disturbing your equanimity." And then let's think about this. What are some inconsequential events that might be, we might have to rise above? And they can be good and they can be bad. And then on the other side of this, the flip side is, what are some consequential events that will and probably should disturb our equanimity? And so maybe you can ask your people to look at what they've written on the index cards and where they fit in, inconsequential or not. Does anybody want to jump in and give an example? I'm going to actually invite one more person here to speak because there is someone up here. Hi, Kristen. I'm very happy to welcome you. And so I'm hoping that everyone will, I'm going to unmute everyone, jump in. Does anyone want to share something that they've experienced, that they've had to rise above? We were talking earlier about our older parents, and I think that can be something. Having to care for a family member is definitely something that you can't really, you can't just ignore it, but you might have to have other responsibilities, and it might be a time that you find that a little more equanimity is needed. I think a lot of it has to do with family or friends or things in your own life, maybe work. So anyway, it'd be interesting to see what other people say and, what they feel about this. I had a friend whose father passed away, and she was also in the middle of changing jobs. She just was finished with an 8-year relationship that dissolved. She moved from California to the East Coast where her parents had lived. And she was on some antidepressant. And she said one day she was like looking at recipes in a book and feeling pretty calm. And she said, but wait a minute, a lot of things have happened to me. I actually shouldn't be feeling equanimity. I actually should be upset. And she stopped taking her antidepressants and she dealt with everything. This was years ago and she's okay. But that's something I want to talk about also. I think a lot of times we want equanimity, but we also need to recognize that there are situations that are going to need thought. So just keep that in mind also. And what do you think are some things that would make it easier for a person to have equanimity? I was thinking about experience. Does that make it easier or harder? I think at some level it makes it easier. And please, anybody jump in because you know that you've dealt with something before and you could probably deal with it again.
In my line of work, I dealt with probably all of life's stresses through somebody else's eyes. I'm a physical therapist, and I practiced for 45 years. Started in the Vietnam era. And I think that I base a lot of my equanimity based on experiences listening and dealing and helping people get through stressful situations. doesn't always cure everything, doesn't always solve it for you. But the fact that you've been through it or witnessed it or experienced it through friends, it certainly helps to stay calm.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
A really good point. Yeah. And it's interesting because one of the questions that relates to this text is, how do you feel when you're with a person who has equanimity? So you might actually be helping some of your patients or some of your friends or family members just with the fact that you've experienced it through others. Like our connection to others, I feel like helps us establish equanimity.
And a lot of people, my husband always asks, why does everybody call you? And sometimes I wonder, but apparently over the years they've identified that I have had experiences and just are interested in just unloading and just passing ideas back and forth. Friendships are very important, and you can learn so much from experiencing other people's stresses. Not that I don't have any myself, which I do, but it's always great to have someone that you can lean on, a good friend, a best girlfriend, or
I agree with you. We shouldn't underestimate the power of the connection of us to people when looking for.
Do you think having a sense of, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I've lost the word, but comparison, being able to say, okay, look, it's a fender bender. It's not, my friend having gone through a major car crash.
Right.
Giving us a sense of proportion.
Right.
Absolutely. I think a sense of proportion is important. And that's why I was thinking that experience might make it easier to have equanimity because you've experienced these things. But then what Donna said is also important, because if you don't have experience, but you can learn from other people who have, I think that's very helpful. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. Okay. So let's look at the next text. What is the foundational midah without which we can't have good character? Equanimity. A person who has mastered peace of mind has gained everything. So first I'm going to tell you a little background. This is from Rav Simcha Zissel Ziv. He lived from 1824 to 1898, so it was a little bit later than the one we just read. He was from Lithuania, later moved to Latvia. When he moved, he changed his name from his father's family name because they were famous rabbis. Their last name was Broud, and he changed it to his mother's last name, which was Ziv. I think in the late 1800s, this was a pretty interesting move. He was one of the foremost students of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who's the founder of the Musar movement. And Rav Simcha Zissel Ziv was also an early leader of the movement. He's best known as the founder and the director of the Kelm Talmud Torah, a famous yeshiva in Lithuania. Unlike other yeshivas, his focused primarily on the study of Musar. And as you might remember, if you've been in earlier sessions or began in October, Musar leaders wanted Torah learning to be applied to character development so that students might become wise and compassionate, not merely learned. So look at what he said about the foundational midah. Do you agree? Do you think that without equanimity, you can't have anything else? Is this like what you're aiming for? Because certainly it feels better to have equanimity. But does that mean you have good character or not, and why?
It almost sounds like you could change equanimity out with mindfulness. That's been the big buzzword recently. And I suppose if you don't have equanimity, you can't pay attention, or you can't pay as good a quality of attention as you should.
It's so interesting that you say that, because at Chai Mitzvah, so we start with our, we have, different tracks, and one of them is our standard topics, which is just what we had before we did Musar. Mm-hmm. And my idea was I wanted each trade, each Musar midah, to relate to whatever the standard topic was, just so that we could have this conversation. And the February standard topic is exactly what you said. It's mindfulness. So they definitely do relate. You actually can't have equanimity without mindfulness, I think, because it means focusing on where you are and not, having your mind out somewhere with other worries. So I think that's a good answer to what equanimity has to do with mindfulness. I think, I'm not sure, and I think there's probably no wrong answer. I'm not sure if it's the only thing you need to have good character, the most important thing. It's a good question. You might want to give a list of midot to your group. I can put one in my follow-up email and ask them what they think are important midot to have for a good character. Like, what's the most important? I'd also like to ask you another question that I think is interesting. What does peace of mind and gaining everything look like in your own life? In my life, I think peace of mind is everything. So in that way, I see the relation. But I'd love to hear what somebody else thinks would be gaining everything in their life.
It's wonderful if you can have peace of mind. You know, the stresses of our day and our lives and everything that's going on. I try to have equanimity and I try to have peace of mind. Sometimes I feel like we're all being bombarded by thousands and thousands of stressors.
I think that's true. I think equanimity is important. Also, one of my friends has everything that I wish I had. You know, like, she really doesn't have the worries I have about different things, yet she's always stressed about different things, which wouldn't stress me. So I think perspective is important. And I don't know. I mean, maybe the things I'm stressed about wouldn't stress her. So I don't know. But definitely some kind of perspective, I think, might be a very important thing for all of us. And the other
peace of mind in this particular respect is something like, you know, having a firm balance point in the middle of your life. And once you've got that, you can look and see things in their true proportion. And once you do that, you realize not everything is such a darn crisis. And I think it does free up more of your personal energy to enjoy and to really experience what's going on in front of you instead of all the worries in your skull.
That's a very good point. And that's where equanimity would be a foundational meetup, because doing exactly what you say, having some perspective and a pivotal point, and like knowing, putting things more in perspective is important. I agree.
I wonder if we're almost inverted in the things that we think are important. This is Liz.
Yeah.
So I wonder, one of my New Year's resolutions for myself was to be more mindful. And I tell my students all the time that this is inherent in Judaism. That's what blessings are all about, is knowing about the farmer who planted the seed and the rain that nourished the seed and all of the transportation and coordination that goes into harvesting and getting that seed, that food on your table. That should be the important things, not whatever the current crisis is in the world, that you might have control over your response to it in your own life, but it won't change the global environment. You know, like if you are losing sleep at night because Greenland is shrinking, and that's going to affect our environment for our grandchildren. You can do small things to help that, which we're also commanded to do in Judaism. But what you should really focus on is the living a mindful life.
I think that's very important. I agree with you completely. What I always say is, when, you know, I have a lot of friends who are very, very bent out of shape over many things, and I don't blame them. I completely understand. But what I say is I try to do what I can with what I've got. So it's important to me to affect those people that I touch in a positive way, or like, I'm sure you know, it's our job to start the job. We don't have to finish it. And we shouldn't get overwhelmed with the idea that maybe we can't finish it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So That's a good perspective to keep. And that hopefully will give us some peace of mind and some equanimity. Which kind of leaves us to the next text, which is Alan Marinis. He's the founder of Musar Institute, which is based in Vancouver. Some information about him. He was born in 1949 into a secular Jewish home in Toronto. And he's an anthropologist, a filmmaker, and a writer. And he was trained, he's also a Rhodes Scholar. That's where he studied anthropology. This text is from a work called Everyday Holiness, the Jewish Spiritual Path of Musar, which is a highly practical set of teachings for cultivating personal growth and spiritual realization in day-to-day life. So this is, kind of like a self-help book almost. Tranquility doesn't spell the end of our spiritual struggles. It's the inner quality that equips us to handle them. This is kind of like what we were talking about before. Tranquility is it's the means to, not the end goal. For a deep and rewarding spiritual life. And we can agree with this or disagree with this. And we can look in our own lives. What are the things that unsettle us? And if we know what they are, that's a good step in cultivating equanimity. I think it's really important. And some things that are kind of related to it, other midot, like patience, humility, gratitude, trust, deliberation, simplicity, and order. If you're doing this as a group or in chavruta with pairs, you can, put these out there and discuss how each one's related to equanimity and see what people think. Now, obviously, there's no wrong answers. Then you can come back as a group and discuss what other midot do you think are important besides tranquility in our spiritual, that helps us carry our spiritual. I'm not going to say struggles. I'd rather say growth. Any comments or questions or anything? Okay, well, I'll go to the next one then. This is an interesting one. It's from Exodus, and it discusses Pharaoh's change of heart after letting the Israelites go. So I think it's interesting because we've been looking at what Musar masters have written, and all of a sudden we're in Exodus. But it's about decision making and what part equanimity plays in decision making. So I'll read the text. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials had a change of heart about the people and said, "What have we done that we've let Israel go from serving us?" So looking at this, I'm the first thing that came to my mind is like, why was this the text that was chosen? And what I thought of was maybe it's just that this story is so familiar to all of us. But I bet we can all think of other situations where decision-making has been hard, and people have deliberated and gone back and forth because they didn't have the confidence or the equanimity or the presence of mind in one way or another to just make a decision and stick with it. So I think this is a good opportunity to think about decision-making, and share our own experiences about decisions we've had to make and how we've made them. For me, it was like, you can make a decision that's rational or emotional. And I think it's interesting to think about that. Like, is it better to make an emotional or a rational decision? Do you think that this conversation about decision making, are we advocating for one or the other? Like, which do you think is more important? I'll put it out there. An emotional decision or a rational decision?
Hopefully our emotional decisions have been made on rational thought. True.
I mean, I try to make rational decisions, but I'm pretty sure that 9 out of 10 times are actually emotional. And it's good if they can be both, if you can make a rational decision and then feel really good about it. And I think probably one of the most terrible situations is when you know what the rational decision is, and it's really something you feel terrible doing because you just don't want to do it. I think that might be a source of great conflict in decision making. I think it's important to think about the process of decision making, because that's something that can really help us lose our equanimity. Anyone want to jump in here and comment about decision making? Okay, I think it's probably one of the most things you can take away from this midah, like the most useful, sort of like something you can go away with. It's like, how are you making decisions and why? I know salesmen or, people who are in that field who say that every decision is actually emotional and people just rationalize it. And when I've heard that, it made sense to me. But yet I know people who might be less emotional and might make their decisions on a more rational level. And I respect those people. I'm not sure I'm one of them. But anyway, if no one else has a comment, we can go to the next text, which is interesting. You look at this text and you might wonder how it relates to equanimity. Return, O my soul, to your rest. This is usually something that we think of in relation to death. And it reminds us that our time is limited and we should live our lives with a purpose and priority. So, and that's where equanimity comes in, to prioritizing. A really nice question to discuss, but you have to feel very free to answer this. Do you feel that you're able to prioritize things in your life in a way that adds wisdom and meaning to your interactions with others and also to your accomplishments? It probably depends where you are in your life in general as well. Does anybody want to answer this question?
Loaded.
Yeah, right? But that's why it's such a great discussion. What do you think?
I think we all want to.
Yeah. So I think that as I get older, always I try to prioritize for sure. You try to think what's most important in your life, and you try to, there are times when things that are really important, like my kids, will make it hard for me to focus on work. And that's where equanimity comes in. But at the same time, I think priorities it's important to keep in your mind your priorities, even if I am ignoring something that needs my attention that I can attend to later, because I have to, I'm doing something that can't be at a different time for work, let's say. I feel like we need to always know very clearly in our own minds, to be honest with ourselves and know what's going on. And another nice question to ask from this text is, who or what is the most important priority in your life? So, not necessary to answer it on this webinar, but interesting to think about and perhaps talk about with the people in your group. Okay, here's another nice one. This is from Psalm 23, and it talks about the everlasting protection and guidance of God. This psalm is well known in Judaism. It's commonly recited at funerals and during Yizkor. But let's think about it here as a rest for people who are alive and achieving a state of peace and rest and equanimity. So God leads me beside still waters. In that context, what does still waters represent for you? Well, I'll jump in and say it represents real Menuchat Hanefesh, real rest. It's interesting because we like to vacation where there's water. But I've always felt that, and I live on the water, but I've always felt that there's no vacation if you're not at rest with your responsibility. If you don't have equanimity, you can have a vacation at home if you have equanimity, and you can be in a beautiful beach and still feel as tense as anything, because the real rest, I think, is when you feel balance and equanimity. And the next question, which is a great one to discuss, is what can you do to help achieve the state of balance within yourself? Any suggestions? Okay, so I think from this, what we've been doing in this session, I think some of the things we can do are to be honest with ourselves, to identify what is making us not have this equanimity that we'd like to have, to, as Donna said, reach out to a friend or have a friend reach out to us, look at our experiences and have someone else help us look at our experiences and guide us so that we don't freak out, so that we know that things are okay, or that, just feel that someone is caring for you. And this text, God, we can feel a sense that God is caring for us as well. And actually, what we do in Musar, which you probably know, is there are practices to help us with the things we're trying to do. So these practices cover all the aspects of equanimity that we've been discussing. The first one relates directly to the aspect we were just discussing, decision making. It says, in the practice of equanimity, one should try to be especially attuned to bichira, choice, to clear thinking and clear decision making. Be mindful of decisions on the horizon and give enough time and space to discern the proper path. And that's a good point. Sometimes we just don't have enough time, or we don't take the time. So that's like an important one. The second practice relates to an aspect of equanimity that we didn't talk so much about, Shabbat, but it's important, having a day to rebalance. And, you know, of course, in our practice, that's Shabbat. There are many different ways to observe it, from traditional to more personal. And so you can think about personally, how do you observe Shabbat? So I'm not that traditional. I don't go to synagogue every Shabbat. I use electricity. I drive in my car. But I never work on Shabbat. I never answer emails. I always plan activities with my priority people, my family and friends. And I really do need this to establish equanimity. Does anyone want to share their feelings about Shabbat? Okay, well, I'll just tell you what it says here for our practices. Shabbat's an amazing practice for building equanimity. By having a day to avoid what might be stressful during the week, we can focus on spiritual matters of the soul. It's a day to be and not to do. A suggestion is to practice one, I actually can't see my screen, to practice one Shabbat or part of one Shabbat without going on the internet, texting, shopping, using your car or appliances. And actually later in this webinar, in a little while, there's a website you can go to, which is about this. You might have heard of it. If not, I'll tell you about it. Prepare your meals ahead of time. Spend the day with friends or family. Be in nature. Go to synagogue. Read. Meditate. So I'd love to ask you guys, what does the perfect Shabbat look like to you? All right. So
I would say yoga in the morning, and reading.
Very nice. That sounds really nice. Yeah, I was talking about this yesterday because Shabbat is also, I know, a very good practice for being more mindful. And it was interesting how many people said they do their errands on Shabbat because that's when they can do them. But that is not at all. I mean, it's good to get stuff done, but that's not, you know. And I was saying yesterday that, so I was brought up in a very traditional family, and what I do for Chai Mitzvah, besides this, which I love, I do graphics. I was always an artist. And as a little girl, I couldn't draw on Shabbat because we didn't do that. And if Shabbat came right before, let's say, the beginning of Passover, there were like 3 days in a row I couldn't draw. And that drove me crazy. So I think you need to prioritize, at least in my opinion, I like to prioritize the things that are going to give me peace of mind and make me feel renewed. And those are the things I do. I would never work, but I might draw a picture. So that's a thought to have for my perfect Shabbat. What about you, Donna? I'm going to put you on the spot.
I find being in the temple and being surrounded by my temple family and friends is a very a wonderful thing for me to balance, find equanimity. I forget what's going on outside of the building, and I'm there to either practice and follow what is in the prayer book, or to just sit and think. And so it's a wonderful time for me to reset. It's an important time for me, surrounded by all the things, the symbols that are important to me. It's a great time. I love Shabbat. And I was not raised in a religious family, an observant family at all. But on Friday nights, my grandmother from Lithuania used to light Shabbat candles, Shabbos candles. And she taught us no phones, no radio at that time, just to sit and talk and to share. And we try to do that.
That is absolutely as important today as it was then. And that's a really good point. And, if we're doing this with groups, it might be nice to plan a Shabbat celebration with your group together, a meal or...
Yeah, we have Sisterhood Shabbat this Friday, which is a wonderful opportunity for women to do everything during the service. And I find that especially calming. I think it's great that the women do that. The rabbi sits back and smiles. And
I think, and another thing I want to point out that you said that's very important, that both prayer and being in a place where you are connected to people and symbols, that's like one of the main things for establishing equanimity is, you know, being able to pray, meditate, think about what's important to you, you know. Liz, it sounded like you were going to say something. Okay. So more practices. The goal of surfing, this is a very cool one. I do this with the teens. The goal of surfing is to stay on top of an inherently unstable wave and not fall off the board or get pulled under the turbulence. So one of the ways to practice equanimity, and you can learn the ability to do that, is stand with your feet slightly apart, visualize yourself riding the surfboard, shift your weight from one foot to the other, pay special attention to your balance as the waves shift. And if you practice this daily, it's kind of like a meditation or a yoga pose. This can help you be aware of your equanimity and help you to think about it each day. Another one, meditation, kind of what Donna was talking about. It's a well-known practice for building equanimity into one's life. And that's how Liz starts her perfect Shabbat, right? If you've never done it before, one simple practice is to close your eyes and just focus on your breath, noticing how it moves inside your body. When your mind wanders, return to the focus on the breath. I have to say that in my summer marina where we live, there's a woman across, she's on the boat across from us. I don't know how old she is, pretty old. She used to be in Cirque du Soleil. So this woman who's got to be in her late 70s, every single muscle she has control of. And she can, she can pretty much like just hold herself up sideways. But the thing that's interesting is every Shabbat morning, she does a yoga class. We stand on our bows and we breathe and do this. And it is a wonderful way to start Shabbat. So that's an interesting thing. And then another practice is a mountain pose. And there's a link here which can help you see how to do it if you'd like to. And like the mountain, which remains constant regardless of snow, rain, etc. Imagine what it would be like to remain relatively constant and unruffled in response to news, as we're talking about, and other external stimuli. So that's a very important thing. More practices. I love this. I was just thinking about putting these in my pocket. You might want to write one of these phrases and put it in your pocket or put it somewhere so that you can repeat it to yourself when you become worried or overwhelmed. And I'm going to ask you which is your favorite after I read them, so think about it. Do not become agitated on the way. Calmness and humility are partners. May there be peace within your ramparts. Beside tranquil waters, God leads me. Rise above the good and the bad. Be calm and deliberate. Consider matters before speaking or acting. And as you can see, each of these kind of refers to one of the texts and one of the discussions we had. We talk about retaining equanimity. We talk about being calm and deliberate, considering matters. So, which is your favorite, Donna, if you have one?
Consider matters before speaking or acting. They're all fantastic, but that one speaks to me.
I like that. What about you, Liz?
Rise above the good and the bad.
I like that a lot too. I mean, there's not one that's right or wrong. I'm just curious. Kristen, you haven't really spoken, and I'm not even sure actually if you.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Do you have one that is your favorite?
I think be calm and deliberate.
That's a good one too. For me, calmness and humility are partners. I don't know why. I guess it's about being having perspective. But as you all said, all of them are good, and it's just interesting to see which speaks to which person and why. So I thought that might be interesting to do. And then we have, some time for personal reflection. So as you know, each source book has questions on the back to help the participants focus on their independent projects. And at the end of the session, take a little time, look at these questions and see how they relate to equanimity. And then depending on your group, you can either discuss this together, or you can, just write them down in the spaces. What insights have you gained from your independent study? How have these insights affected your day-to-day equanimity? And how have your independent projects affected the equanimity of others? It's always nice to see how what you do affects other people as well. And then these are some really good additional information links. So I'm really excited to share them with you. If unplugging from your devices once a week for Shabbat seems like a stretch for you, get involved in the National Day of Unplugging. This project is predicated on the belief that in our busy lives, we no longer know how to take a break in order to recharge, which was a biblical idea behind the Sabbath day. There's a New York Times article about it that you can read on the Sabbath, the iPhone shall rest. And the suggestion is even try it for an hour. You don't even have to try it for that long, and see how it works for you. And then on the other end of the spectrum, Abraham Joshua Heschel's The Sabbath is a very good book, which will take a lot more personal time than unplugging for an hour. And then there's more information about meditation. You can look at the podcast from the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. And I can't see the other one. I have to move my people here. Whoops. Oh, Awaken Heart Project, another really good one. So you can try either of these. It will give you instructions even on how to practice meditation.
I actually have a comment on that first one. One of the things that I did about 6 months ago, because, at the beginning of the service, somebody on the board from the board who's on the beam will remind everybody, put your phones on silent or turn them off or whatever. So I put my phone on silent, and I realized a couple days later I had not taken it off. And, which didn't mean I didn't use my phone, but I just didn't respond to every time it pinged at me. And I just felt so good about it that I haven't turned it back on since.
That is for 6 months?
For 6 months, it has been on silent, which, like I said, the emails still come in, text messages, everything's still coming in. But now I go and look at it when I feel it's important.
That is a great thing for mastering the constant barrage that is our lives these days. And I think that's really interesting, and certainly something that I bet a lot of people haven't done. And I think it's great. I really do. 6 months, that's amazing. I use this excuse that I want to be around if my kids need me, but realistically, they're all adults. So I think it's awesome. I give you a lot of respect for that. That is just wonderful. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that comment. That's really wonderful. So I would like to ask if there are any questions or comments, anything else anybody wants to say before we finish our discussions. Okay, well, I think it's been really, I really appreciate what you've said. And when I do the follow-up email, I'm definitely putting in something about turning off your phone and about having other people, really, how that relates to equanimity, because that's something that I think is not talked about enough. I think it's really good. So thank you for your insights and your thoughts. Anything else? Okay, then. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and I'm looking forward to your being in other webinars as well.
Thanks, Nina.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
Hi, Kristen.
Hi, Donna.
In my group.
That's awesome. You have a great group.
Thanks.
Okay.